said, I'm coming from Bethany Kids, so that's sort of my current reality, my current everyday life is you sort of work from home like many people and trying to raise money, raise awareness, and have strategic programs in a medical charity in the midst of a medical pandemic. So it's been a year. 2 weeks ago, we were talking a little bit about the Beatitudes. And before we jump into this week's, I wondered if maybe someone who was here in our teaching when I was here last, I'd sort of shared what I felt like maybe some overall perspective or function of the Beatitudes, something that I felt like maybe they were saying as a whole. So I wonder, does anyone remember what we talked about 2 weeks ago? Not the specific Beatitude, but those general themes that we talked about, so that it's not me reviewing. Is there anyone else who can remember some of that? Not to put you all on the spot, but I think there was a few of you who are here today who were here 2 weeks ago. So does anyone remember what we talked about with Beatitudes 2 weeks ago?
We talked about justice a couple of weeks ago, and those that we overlook, those who are not given justice and unjust systems.
Yeah. Thank you, Keely. Anyone else? Anything you want to share from 2 weeks ago before we jump into today's?
Remember, we talked about the Beatitudes being an encouragement to the people in the audience, those who were suffering from various issues in their lives, and not that it was prescriptive for a style of living, but an encouragement for everyone.
Okay, thank you. I know for me, that's really important, what's just been said there, that when we come to the Beatitudes, we're not looking for the new 10 commandments. We're not looking at another sort of to-do list, but this is Jesus looking at a people who have been hurt, looking at people who have been forgotten, who have been nameless, and saying, I see you, I hear you, and I know that you are blessed and you are loved. And I think that that perspective is really true as well as we look at this today. The blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And I think when we get to this one, there's obviously the two big questions we have to ask, like, who are the pure in the heart, and what does it mean to see God, right? If Jesus says he's looking out at this audience, he's already said a bunch of things, and he gets to this, he says, blessed are the pure in heart, they will see God. Seeing God, of course, is a big deal. In the Old Testament, the people who were sort of Israelites, people who followed the Jewish faith, seeing God was such a big deal. Very few times in the Old Testament would someone see the face of God. There was a sense that if we saw God's face, we would we'd sort of be burned up in his holiness. Like we couldn't handle it. Even Moses sort of seeing just the backdraft of God, like just, see my reflection. Seeing God was a big deal. And it was also the thing that in some ways everyone wanted, or at least the religious people wanted to get to see God. And this sense of God being so holy, so pure, so set apart that we couldn't see him. That was the sort of basic belief of the people. He's so good, so holy, that to see him in our own sin would tear us apart. You've probably heard people say how in the temple structure, once a year as the high priest goes in, they would literally tie a rope on him in case he sort of burned up or he died because of God's purity and his sin. Like they'd pull him out. There's a sense it was so unapproachable, so distant. So when we say that the pure in heart are going to see God, this is a big deal. We're not just saying, oh yeah, they're going to experience some fulfillment. No, this is a big deal. And these words, this language would have really triggered the very religious people saying, well, how can you see God? That's not possible. And who are these pure in heart? Because when we get to pure in heart, purity was also something that was a very big deal in society. The notion that the priest, the high priest, the Pharisees were all trying to do the right thing. They were trying to be pure and blameless before God. There's this sense of holiness, of right living. There's a big culture of ritual cleaning. The cleanliness that would make even our COVID standards seem pale in comparison. There was a sense that holiness, set apartness, purity was the center of all things of faith. Maybe you've traveled around the world. I know if you've gone into different sort of buildings, you see even today there's some hangovers from that purity culture or the holiness culture, that certain things are deemed unclean. My wife and I, we've traveled to a number of places, And you'll go to temples or mosques or museums, and there'll often be signs like, if you're pregnant, you're unholy, you cannot come in. If you're on your period, you cannot come in. If you've just touched this, or if you haven't washed your hands since coming from this kind of place, there's this whole structure of purity, to be pure, to be clean. Now, in the ancient world, of course, we have that purity culture around ritual. How I would say we've probably adopted that in North America is we've made purity culture more about morality. But we've placed the same emphasis, we've placed the same almost legalism around it to say, well, you've done this, you've done that, you're not accepted. We can look in our seat of judgment and say, oh, the sort of purity culture around ritual purity of the past was archaic and it's foolish, and I'm so glad we're so enlightened now. But we place the same kind of emphasis on other things. We've got purity rings and purity culture. We've gotten to the place, even within Western Christianity, where purity is the gospel, right? To be a follower of Jesus is somehow wrapped up in how we describe purity. But I perceive that there maybe is a continued inconsistency. And I'll give you one example. I obviously have lived in Kuwait the last couple of years, last 8 years, and it's a very religious society. Structurally, it follows a lot of those purity laws. So if you have sex before marriage, you go to jail. If you are seen to be consuming alcohol, you go to jail. If you eat pork, you are in trouble. You would potentially go to jail. You would certainly face a fine. There's this huge emphasis on that sort of holiness or ritual purity. Marriage is seen as the perfect ideal. People marry, people wear clothing that is seen to be modest. So we live in that kind of society. But then I'd go on vacation and I would say to the hotel person, oh, I'm from Kuwait. And they'd say, oh, interesting. Typically when people come from Kuwait, they check in their multiple wives who are wearing abayas and hijabs, and then they come back to the front desk and they ask where the strip club is. There's this inconsistency where we have the pretense of purity, the pretense of perfection. But in our core, in our heart, we're just the same as everybody else. A friend of mine, and this was this last week, I was talking to a friend and she grew up in Kuwait. And when she went to university in the UK, she talked to one of the recruiters. And the recruiter said that typically families from certain parts of the world will come and they'll try to wine and dine the recruiter, the lecturers, and would say, and this was her experience in her own family, the recruiters would be taken out to strip clubs by these fathers. And those locations, the father would say, listen, you know, we have a different culture in the Middle East. Please take care of my daughter, you know, make sure she doesn't get into trouble as they sit in a strip club. There's this inconsistency, this hypocrisy. Now, it's, of course, very easy for us to look at someone else's culture and say, oh, I see your inconsistency. But I think the same could be true in our own lives, that people could look at our hearts and look at what we post online and see an inconsistency. We could very easily, each of us could be outed in whatever capacity to see that our actions, our words on the outside don't always match what's in the inside. And Jesus speaks out in different ways. He says to the pure in heart, bless you. You're going to see God's face. But he says to the religious people, and this is coming from later in Matthew 23, he says, you're hypocrites. You're like tombs that have been whitewashed, that have been beautified. And on the outside, you look beautiful, but on the inside, you're filled with death and things that are unclean. Again, that's a conversation in Matthew 23. I see in Jesus a real tension around this subject of purity. He looks at those who are struggling. He looks at those who've been forgotten and says, bless you, pure in heart. You will see God. And then he looks at the religious people and he says, you are hypocrites. One of the things we talked about 2 weeks ago was we love to sit ourselves in the seat of blessing in the Beatitudes, right? We love to think, Jesus, thank you for these blessings. This is so great. You're talking to me, right? But the Pharisees were trying to do the right thing for the most part. They were the religious people. They were probably the most similar to us. And they're the ones he's calling hypocrites. They're the ones he's calling out. You're like whitewashed tombs, he says. One of the areas that maybe there's a tension, if you're on social media, you can see people will frequently post about a cause. Oh, donate to this cause. This is a great cause. Here's a black square. Do this, do that. But if that doesn't impact the way we treat our neighbor, if it doesn't impact the way I live my life with the people around me, then it's meaningless. It's hypocrisy. And of course, it's interesting to think that the number one judgment I hear of Christians from non-Christians is hypocrisy. There's this sense that they perceive us to be more worried about reputation than about action. But amidst all of that, Jesus looks at the pure in heart. He says, bless you. You will see God's face. Those who perhaps even religion has seen to be impure, you're not holy enough to go into a temple, and bless you. You will see God's face. It will not be denied you. Bless you. Those who've been forgotten. Again, there's this tension throughout the Old Testament, or the New Testament and the Old Testament, but one place I think it really is crystallized, and I put it in the notes, I hope, but something I'd like, maybe we can go through and read this interaction. And this comes from Matthew 7. Matthew 7 is one of these places where there's a clash between the sort of purity that Jesus has in mind and the purity that the culture, the society has in mind, particularly the religious culture. So this is Matthew 7, and I'm going to read it, and then we can kind of see some of the things that come out of it. Matthew 7 says this: the Pharisees and some of the teachers of the law who'd come from Jerusalem gathered around Jesus and saw some of his disciples eating food with their hands that were defiled, that is, unwashed. The Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they give their hands a ceremonial washing, holding to the tradition of their elders. When they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. And they observe many other traditions, such as the washing of cups, pitchers, and kettles. So the Pharisees and teachers of the law asked Jesus, why don't your disciples live according to the tradition of the elders instead of eating their food with defiled hands? And he replied, Isaiah was right when he prophesied about you hypocrites. It is written, these people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. They worship me in vain. Their teachings are merely human rules. You've let go of the commands of God, and you're holding on to the human traditions. Like today, I see the challenge that I think the words that Jesus spoke then are just as true today to our churches, to ourselves. And it is always easy for us to say other churches have this. But I think if we want to be genuine, if we want to truly follow Jesus and not be hypocrites, it's worth saying, maybe this is about me today. Maybe there's something that I've got to figure out, that I've got to sort through. Maybe there's an inconsistency. Maybe I'm more worried about the pretense of goodness than I am about being good. Now, again, we live in a society that is hyper-hygienic right now, I hope. We're not even meeting in person because of hygiene. You would not think of shaking a stranger's hand right now. You would not even come, hopefully, within 6 feet. You probably, you've got hand sanitizer in the car. You come back in the car and you wash it right away. The idea of coming from the marketplace to the dining table without washing, we'd say, oh, that's terrible. But this wasn't just about hygiene. There was this sense of impurity that out there, the impure people live. And we want to be pure on the inside, these sort of temple versus marketplace, and this deep contrast that the religious society had set up. And I feel like there's this critique that Jesus is making about those kinds of people. And so we continue, and this is what he says. You have a fine way of setting aside the commands of God in order to observe your own traditions. Moses said, honor your father and mother, and anyone who curses their father or mother would be put to death. But you say, if anyone declares declares what might have been used to help their father and mother as korban, that is devoted to God, then you no longer let them do anything for their mother and father. This way, thus you nullify the word of God by your traditions that you've handed down. You do many things like that. Just for context, and maybe you've heard this passage talked about a lot, but this notion of korban, what was being done is they'd say, listen, I can't donate to my family because I've set aside money for God. Now, they may never give it to God, but they just say, I set it aside. And it was like this, it was like a tax haven. It was like a cheat. It was this way to get around donating money to those in need. Oh, sorry, I've given it the office. I can't help, right? When I was a kid, I used to like raise money for the Salvation Army. And those guys with the bells who are maybe annoying on the side of the street? I used to do that for hours and hours as a teenager. And it was amazing the creativity that people had to avoid making eye contact with someone asking for money. right? You'd say, hey, can you, throw in a coin to help someone? And they're like, oh yeah, I just got a call. It didn't ring, but I just got a call. I'm just going to take my phone. Or you'd see people, they'd be walking straight towards you, and without eye contact, they'd switch doors. I didn't say anything. I didn't ask them. I didn't berate them, but my sheer presence made them move to another door, or pretend to take a phone call, or pretend to rustle around in the person. Suddenly, as soon as they passed me, their eyes went back up. We are very creative people when it comes to avoiding things that maybe we know we're supposed to do, whether it be give money or give time or spend time with people. We, like the ancient people that Jesus is talking about, we invent cultures and traditions to get around this basic premise of actually just loving our neighbors well. So again, Jesus called this crowd. He says, listen to me. Everyone, understand this. Nothing outside a person can defile them by going in. Rather, it's what comes out of the person that defiles them. After he left the crowd and he entered the house, his disciples asked him, what about this parable? Are you so dull, he asked. Don't you see that nothing that enters the person from the outside can defile him? For it doesn't go into their heart, but it goes into their stomach. And then he went out of the body, and then it goes out of this body. In saying this, Jesus declares all foods clean. And he went on, what comes out of a person is what defiles them. For it's from within, out of a person's heart, what evil thoughts come: sexual immorality, theft, murder, adultery, greed, malice, deceit, lewdness, envy, slander, arrogance, folly. All of these evils come from inside and defile a person. Jesus is speaking to this culture that was worried about pretense, worried about reputation more than they were worried about heart. He's speaking to a group of people who are so obsessed with moral purity or symbolic purity that they forget to actually just follow their heart and love well. Now, of course, in our society as Christians, we look at this list and we say, well, we can tell the most important one's got to be sexual immorality. Like, that's the one. If you say, well, the pastor's had a failing, a moral failing, you can almost guess that it's only one of the things on this list. It's not envy or deceit or slander or arrogance or greed. It's probably sexual immorality and adultery, right? I mean, I don't know what your experience with the church is, but that has become our new litmus test for who's moral and who's not. But Jesus critiques that kind of hyper legalism. He critiques it and says it matters from what comes from within. We live in this era of superficial judgment. You see someone on Instagram and you judge them for how they look. You see someone and we judge them, and we assume people judge us for our exteriors. But Jesus, I think, is pushing us to consider first and foremost the heart. Not so that we would pretend to be good people, not so that we would have, we would look like we're anti-racist, right? This is one of the, we'll say, the topics the church is fortunately grappling with right now. And my fear is that we're all going to pretend to look like we're anti-racist now. Okay, I've got a black square. I'm not racist anymore. See, guys, I'm not racist. What about if someone who doesn't look like you wants to marry one of your children or become your neighbor or go into business with, right? It's great to look like you're not racist or sexist, but your actions, your heart, how you react when you meet someone on the street. I think it's worthwhile, every one of us saying, maybe Jesus is speaking these words to me, and maybe I can do better, not in my actions, but in my heart. Again, we live in an era that likes to see the outset. One of the things I think is interesting with the Pharisees is they saw the marketplace as an unholy place. But they say the temple is the holy place. And just before this story takes place, just before you have this interchange about, oh, they came from the marketplace is where the sinners hang out, marketplace is bad. Just before this story, the 2 or 3 sentences which precede it, that's the end of Matthew 6, Jesus is in the marketplace. And people are coming to the marketplace. And what is happening in the marketplace? Jesus is healing people. Like just before the Pharisees say, oh, the marketplace is unholy, impure, wash yourself after coming from that sin, Jesus is there. And instead of being covered in the sin that the Pharisees thought you might catch, this disease of sin you might catch in the marketplace, Jesus is there and he's inverted it. Instead of getting unholy, he's making the marketplace holy, a place of healing, a place of purity, a place where people find new life. And I think as we consider where we are as Christians, we have a tendency to sort of avoid those types of places, right? Oh, I'm a holy person, I don't go to those places. When I was a kid, the phrase was, we're in, not of. So we stay away from those places. But Jesus shows up in the messy places. Jesus shows up, and out of heart, purity of heart heals people. Now, in a moment, we're going to take some time to talk about what does it mean to be pure in heart? What is our experience with this sort of purity culture? So we'll start to think about some of those things. But I just wanted to end this with a story from one of my colleagues from within Bethany Kids. So this is a woman. She was born in a Maasai community. So she's a Maasai woman. That's her culture, her community, her language group. That is her people. But she was also born with cerebral palsy. And that meant that she was seen to be a curse on the family, seen to be a burden, seen to be a problem. And this woman's name is Francesca. And Francesca, when she was young, her parents, her uncles, the grandparents saw that she was a curse. She was unclean. Because she had cerebral palsy, she was not able to manage her bowels in the same way that perhaps someone else would. They saw her as unclean, as dirty, as unholy. And their solution to unclean things was to try to kill her. So they tried to kill Francesca and remove her from the family, to get rid of the unholiness. She was saved, she ran away or was taken away with a family member, was rescued. In her teenage years, though, she said that as she grew up, by the time she was a teenager, and I think I shared some of this 2 weeks ago, but by the time she was a teenager, she had never yet had a day where she wasn't soaked in her own bodily fluids. She didn't know about it. She didn't know what it was meant to be dry. And she told me that in that life, that was where she was. She felt so unclean that in that moment, she wanted to kill herself. And she felt like her parents were right to do so. But somewhere in there, she encountered a church. And the church was the first group of people who saw her as a clean person, as someone who was pure in heart, someone who's beautiful. And the church put her in touch with Bethany Kids. This was almost 20 years ago. And they taught her about what it was like to care for your body. She lived in a society that saw it as a curse. She finally encountered someone who saw her as a child of God. That transformed her life. That transformed the way she saw herself. That transformed the way other people saw her. She now is part of our team helping other people care for themselves and learn how to care for their different challenges, whether it be cerebral palsy, hydrocephalus, spina bifida. For her, that experience started with a revolutionary experience around Jesus, around seeing that she was pure. She wasn't what society saw her as. So I come back to the sense of our whole notion of purity, of perfection, of all the things that we have shaken around our head. I feel like we've got a lot of religious baggage around there that makes us more with the Pharisees than maybe some of the people who Jesus was saying, bless you. So I want to get to some questions here, and I've probably talked for far too long and rambled on, but I want to hear some of your thoughts on this. And the first question I want to put to you is, when Jesus says in that room, in that context, blessed are the pure in heart, who do you figure he's talking about? Who do you think he's talking about in that room, in that space? So I'll just sort of mute myself, and I want to hear your thoughts. We all read this passage differently. You've been going through the Beatitudes for weeks. Who's he talking to? Who are the pure in heart in his day? And let me just say, I know we're a small group, so that means we're all going to have to jump in on this one.
I think that perhaps it's the people who are just quietly going along, doing what they know deep down is right. They don't have a lot of power. They don't get seen by a lot of people. That's not why they do it. They're just those people that are quietly doing their thing. That's a start anyway.
That's good. Thank you. I think that's spot on. Anyone else want to add to that and sort of add your experience into that question?
Well, I think, as I said, it's a matter of not doing something because you'll be seen as good as you talked about, but because you know it's right. So it's just, if someone is giving to the poor or gives to charity, or it's the difference between giving to charity only if, like, okay, you'll be on TV and saying, it's like, oh, I gave to this charity, look at me, versus, okay, it's like you're passing someone on the street who's asking for money and you give them money. No one's going to know you gave money to, like, that poor person, but it's knowing it's like, okay, I'm doing good because I think it's good not to be seen or not to get rewarded in any way.
Yeah.
So it's just this innate sense of innate goodness.
Absolutely. A friend of mine from Yellowknife recently was saying he's been frustrated, I think, with Instagram a little bit. And he says, I wonder if people would still do the right thing if they couldn't post it on Instagram. Like, would you still serve the poor if you couldn't talk about it on Instagram? Yeah. Great comments from everybody about who Jesus was talking to. And what I appreciated about what you said was that those words were just as true 2,000 years ago, and it could be perfectly accurate today. Second thing I want to get to, because when Jesus talks about purity of heart, I find in the sermons that I've listened to over the years, it seems to be loaded with a lot of specific language that I think we need to kind of wade ourselves through and figure out so that we don't get lost on it. So this second question, I guess, is more so to help us figure out what the purity that Jesus is talking about is. And maybe you've heard this phrase, purity culture, but if that's not a phrase you've heard, but just generally speaking, how have you heard purity or purity culture talked about within the church or within Christian circles?
My lovely parents put me through the boys and girls, go and do your purity church thing with the segregated groups as a teenager. So I went and experienced all that, got the ring and all that stuff. And as a kid, you don't really understand it other than what's being taught to you. And then, like, as you grow older, you realize that actually isn't a super healthy way of teaching kids how like purity works. That's not, it does more damage than it does good, which is unfortunate. But I can respect purity, but not in the way the church has taught it to me.
Yeah, I agree with Joel. I mean, growing up in a conservative Baptist church, no one really talked about, like, sort of sexuality and purity in a healthy way. And it was interesting. I was just talking to a buddy of mine a while ago, and he said they went to a really extreme PAOC, Pentecostal church, and basically you couldn't have sex until you were married. So they all married at 19 and 20. And he said out of, like, his 10 buddies, they're all divorced now. Because the motivation was to keep yourself pure and clean before marriage. But if you're having these hormonal, and you were, like, turned on, then you better get married. So we have this generation of young people that really got married for really the wrong reason, but that was taught to them and taught to us at that time by the church. And in that, our parents too, because that was what they were taught. But, I think that caused a lot of pain for many of us, even including me. And I think now Chris and I are kind of on the opposite, talking to our 13 and 16-year-old really honestly about sexuality and boundaries and consent and understanding your body and all that kind of thing, because we think that's so important to have those honest conversations, not to be ashamed of it. I think in the church there's a lot of shame around sexuality, and so they didn't know how to speak about it and be honest about it and healthy about it. So people who are, sort of under shame about it, sharing it with us just wasn't healthy at all. So, and then you see somebody like, is it Josh? Who was the guy? Not Josh McDowell, but the I Kissed Dating Goodbye. And that book that for us, read in youth group. Yeah. And now he has completely gone against what he wrote and apologized to generations of young people who were impacted by the book and saying that was all wrong. It wasn't healthy. And I did so much damage to the evangelical church. That was that many years ago. So it's been an interesting kind of process for me, and just to see what has happened to my friends from when we were like 16 to now.
I think, everything I've heard so far from those who are sharing, that there's this unhealthiness as how purity is talked about. And also we've made it synonymous with something to do with sex. Right. Purity is about sexuality. I read somewhere recently that the group that most frequently accesses abortion in North America would be Christian evangelicals. So the same group with their signs saying, you guys are the worst, you're killing people. Those are the same people getting abortions, because shame and purity is way more important than anything else, right? There's a sense of, you have to appear pure. You have to appear. So whatever you do, just make sure that everyone thinks you're pure. Make sure that you don't make your family looks a certain way. Like, we've wrapped it all. Purity hasn't been about action or about like serving the poor, right? Like if I ask most Christians, when I say purity, what do they mean? It's not like, oh, my grandmother, she like makes sandwiches for the poor every single day. That's so pure. That's so beautiful. When we hear pure, we get to this sense of like, oh, I don't have sex. And I feel like we've eroded and we've hurt people. I both Mel and Joel, like sharing that, people have been hurt because of how we've messaged purity, and we've turned it into a new idol, I think. Anyone else on this purity culture or the systems of purity that we have talked about and that Jesus speaks to?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, like, similarly, I think, like, I didn't grow up in an evangelical church. I grew up in the mainline church. I came to faith later in an evangelical context. And then every youth retreat that I went on for like the next 5 years was all about sexual purity. Mm. And it was like so super typical because, we would get there, have the big rally, rah, 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 we're all here for Jesus. The boys separate and we go talk about porn and masturbation, and the girls separate and they go talk about body image and modesty. And it propped up this patriarchal, misogynistic model that many of us are unpacking now, because we would come back together and it was obvious that the onus was on the girls to make sure that they weren't causing the boys to stumble.
Oh
yeah. I wasn't really responsible for my own lack of control, right. And it was all about this sort of propped up sort of purity culture, patriarchal, misogynistic model. But never once were we encouraged to have a faith that was outward facing. Our faith was always about personal holiness. Like that was the foundation. Like, you love Jesus? Yeah, great. Don't masturbate, don't look at porn, don't have sex before marriage. Yeah, what about like loving the poor, and what about like advocating for marginalized voices? No, you'll have to figure that out later when you deconstruct your entire faith and realize that it's a sham. So
why is it that when we had that privileged opportunity to bring young people from across churches, it's, you got that focus group. What's the one thing these kids need to know? Is it anti-racism? No, it can't be that. Is it serving the poor? No, I don't think let's talk about sex. That's the one. That's the thing that the church is going to have to occupy all of its airtime with. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as you say, it wasn't just it wasn't just a hurtful thing to everyone in a generic equal way, but women particularly, the modesty culture, right? Yep. And it's a shame because you hear things like body image and you're like, oh yeah, good. We're talking about body image for everyone. This is so important. But what we meant by that was like, how do you portray your body to men?
Yeah, don't wear spaghetti straps.
Don't wear spaghetti straps. That's it, right?
Yep.
It saddens me that this is how we perceive purity. And when I was thinking about this topic, and obviously Grace had asked that this would be the topic we'd speak about today, and I was going through trying to prepare and listening to different sermons, every sermon about this topic is like, don't think about sex. Like, have a pure heart. Don't be thinking about sex. And I'm like, I think there's so much more to it than that, right? Like, how is it that we see other people? Like, how do I see you right now? How do I see each of you? There's a purity of heart there. Of how do I see my neighbor? Some of you might have read the book, his name, Greg Paul, God in the Alley. Older book, it's been around for a little while, but there's a line in it that always strikes me. And he was talking about like when you're serving the poor, when you're serving other people, don't do it as though you think Jesus would serve them, but instead look at them, perhaps the homeless gentleman who's maybe soaked in urine, who's got alcohol on the breath. Look at him and serve him as though he himself were Jesus. Roll out the red carpet, open up the feast tables, and treat them as though Jesus was here in front of us. Otherwise, we've got this savior kind of thing, and we're like, no, look at them with purity in our eyes and say, you're made by God, like me. You're a child of God. But that's not the purity we talk about. Anyone else around this question of what is our experience with purity culture within church, or the phrasing of purity? Something else that you want to share?
I was just going to say that neither of us grew up in evangelical churches, so we never heard about this purity thing, except I noticed as I got older, that actually made it more difficult for me to talk to Jesus or get involved with other people who were part of that, because the purity culture piece instantly was like, I'm not interested. And I'm not interested in purity. What I mean is, it was an immediate us and them kind of a conversation, right? So you couldn't be part of an evangelical kind of youth group or something like that because you couldn't buy into that piece. Or you couldn't. And I think still that's what would keep, we have 3 adult children. I think that issue might be one that would keep them away from some churches still. And that's not what we want. Right? We want the bigger picture ideas that Jesus talked about. So, so there's not always, sometimes I wish I had grown up a little bit more in evangelical church, but when I hear this, it's like, oh,
no.
Thank you.
No.
You don't want that part. That's the baggage you don't want to carry.
That part. There's some other parts that I wish I had.
I was going to say, along with Chris, like, I think, honestly, personally, the damage in that was, when I was younger, I was always considered what they would actually say as a stumbling block to men. So imagine being told that at 16, 17, 18, 19, through Bible college and through church. Yeah. So in my time, that's what people would say. Well, Melinda, you're looking this way, you're acting this way. And for someone who's quite, animated and my extrovert personality, which is a whole nother conversation, was considered a stumbling block to men. And that language was actually what they would consider a language that was appropriate to kind of make sure that, women were modest and behaved in a certain way. And so I completely grew up with that. I mean, I can't believe, I'm still following Jesus at some things, because some of the things that were said over me and my girlfriends as we were kind of like growing up in the church. But it's been an interesting sort of like a healing process in that, because that's just levels then of how we felt about men and how men felt about women and our roles within the church and in our homes, and the role that I play is that my responsibility or is that men's responsibility? Right. So there was years of learning and growing in therapy to kind of get where I am now, to say, okay, this is who I am. Here's the things that I can be responsible for, but those other things, that's on them. Right. That's not me being a stumbling block. Right. And so, I have lots of conversations with my girlfriends now about those years of just really difficult experiences because as a woman, what was placed on us. Right. And now it's been great to say that, we've kind of processed it, healing, forgiveness, and really kind of taking our place as women that God has created for the roles in which we have. So it's been a journey though, Peter, I'll say.
Well, because that, even if today we can look back and say, oh, that was toxic, that was terrible. And I perceive that most of us in this conversation were saying that was an unhealthy thing. It doesn't make it easy anymore, right? Like if you carry an oversized bag for all of your life and finally you take it off, you might say, oh, this feels great to take it off, but you still have back problems for the rest of your life. Like we still have trauma because of how this was talked about. And it's interesting that the stumbling block that I perceive here is the purity culture. That is the stumbling block to people in their faith. The amount of times I've spoken to older adults whose kids have now left home, the reason really the reason those kids have left home, or sorry, that left the faith, has to do with this. There was this sense of, I can't follow a church or a teaching that is so focused on this. And like, but Jesus wasn't, but we are. And I guess one of the things I hope we get out of this is we perceive what the Pharisees were up to, and they were really focused on ritual purity. And we look back and say, oh, that's so bonkers, that's so old-fashioned. But we still hold to certain types of purity. And I look at the actions of Jesus, and this thing about the marketplace, this final question, and I think there's an inversion of the purity structure that takes place. Because prior to this moment, we see that market is unholy, impure, temple is pure. And if you're going to the market, you're going to get, it's like a contagion. You're going to get the impurity on you. And there's this assumption in society that if we go to impure places, however that's defined, we're going to get it on us, and then we get sticky. We can't get it off. But how Jesus behaves is he actually just shows up into those quote unquote impure places and brings hope and healing and restoration and true purity. He shows up in the marketplace. He shows up in places that were deemed impure. And you could say the same thing about marketplaces or dining tables. Jesus shows up with the wrong people. So yeah, just as a final note, before we take some time for some communion and kind of reflect and put this together, Jesus, the marketplace in his world was an actual marketplace, shops and stalls, and that was a place that was deemed impure, but Jesus went anyways. And I think about our society, is there places or are there things that we need to just go into anyways and bring the purity of Jesus? I don't mean bring purity culture, don't mishear me. I mean bring that pure love of Jesus into places that maybe the church hasn't shown up before.
I think that was something really special about how some of Reunion started, was like being in a bar, which is to a lot of churches like the place you should not be as a Christian. You shouldn't be sitting in a bar with a beer. That doesn't go along with talking about Jesus.
Right, that's impure.
Yeah. And so it was really cool to like be there and have other people come up to you and be like, why are you singing? What are you doing here? And have those just spur of the moment conversations with people and see them experience that Jesus can be something else. It's not the sit in a pew, kneel on something uncomfortable. It's about the relationships, not about the ritual. And I always think it's so interesting that like Jesus talks about purity the whole way through his life, and his first miracle was changing water to wine in something that was meant to clean you, something that was meant to make you pure. And that's consistent message throughout, like that we don't need that ritualistic purity. It's about our relational purity, about how we relate to people and are kind to people and make genuine relationships with others.
Yeah, location matters. If we hide away in church silos, location matters. So you're right, showing up in a bar, having a conversation about Jesus, that matters.
Maybe it'd be better if it was in a gay bar, actually, because that's a place where if you want to talk about the purity thing, where you want to show that we don't follow that kind of purity culture, that would be the place to be, I think. I don't know if there is one in Oakville, but what do I know?
I think, it's a good measure to say if it's offensive to Christians, but reassuring and a blessing to our neighbors, then maybe it's the right direction. Because the religious people were offended, but the people were blessed by the presence of Jesus. So maybe you're right. So just if we're thinking of the list of things for Grace next week, you're doing a true crime mystery service, but in a gay bar.
In a gay bar, based on what we've been talking about. So I think that'll hit all the
that'll hit everything, right?
Oh, sign me up.
Yeah. One of the things that I think, and it's a perfect way to sort of bring our time to a close, is this notion of actually sharing a meal, whether it be in a gay bar or wherever. When Jesus had a meal with people who were impure, that was a statement to people. There was this sense of like, he is dining with the sinners. He is sharing personal things with people who were seen to be unclean. And one of the most famous meals we think of, we sometimes call it the Lord's Supper or the Eucharist or communion. And we think about that meal. And one of the things that to me is so striking about that table, the makeup of the table, while it wasn't necessarily particularly diverse regarding gender and race, it is interesting to think about the diversity that was present there. You have, for example, people who within 24 hours say, Jesus, never heard of the guy. I don't know who that guy is. Jesus, nope, don't know him. Judas, oh, Jesus, yeah, I do know him, and he's a criminal, let's arrest him. Like Thomas, oh, I don't even believe, I have no faith, right? These were the kinds of people at the table. And to those people, Jesus takes his body and says, listen, and here, I've got my cracker. But he says, here's my body, I'm breaking it for you, right? Like, I'm breaking my body for you. I'm giving my life for you. Thomas the doubter, Peter the denier, Judas the betrayer. To you, the unholy, impure sinners of the world, Jesus looks at them with this purity and grace and love and says, this is my body. And I will literally break it for you because of my love for you. So today, I want to take a moment as we together celebrate communion. If you've got some supplies, that's beautiful. If not, just please, I want us to consider that moment. Because when Jesus says, this is my body broken for you, I don't think he's saying, and so from now on, break crackers together, right? I think he's saying, take your bodies, your time, your resources, your talents, and have those broken for the sake of others. So you take a moment with me, if you've got a cracker, and just for a moment, just like 20 seconds of silence, and think, this is the body of Jesus, and he's breaking it for you. And he's asking us to partner with him in that. Just take a moment in silence. So Jesus breaks the bread and he shares it with these people, the same people who are going to deny him, same people who are going to betray him. He says, this is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Let's eat this together. This is the new deal. This is the new covenant. This is the new promise that my blood will be shared for you. That this whole thing is going to work not because of the sacrifice of animals or of people or of purity laws or whatever, but he's saying like this is the new purity, my blood for you, so that we might live in a new covenant. I've asked Joel to cue up a song and just to give us a time to reflect, to think. I always say that, you know, when we think about songs, they're just sung prayers. I just want to, again, thank you as a community for being the kind of people you are, for being pure in heart as you seek to invite people into your space, as you meet in pubs and obviously next week in a gay bar. I'm thankful for who you are, for seeking to be more about love than about reputation. And I just pray that continues to be the core value of your community. So thank you for who you are. Thank you for your conversation this morning and for the honesty around some of the ways that as a church maybe we failed each other. I just wanted to end our time with an old prayer that I think is a great reminder for what it maybe means to be pure in heart and thinking about how we view the world. This is an old prayer. You might recognize it. It says this: God be in my head and in my understanding. God be in my eyes and in my looking. God be in my mouth and my speaking. God be in my heart and my thinking. God be at my end and at my departing. So thank you guys for who you are. And I pray that God and his love for others continues to define all that we do.